In the spring of 1943, in a pine forest west of Smolensk, German soldiers began digging. What they found was a mass grave, and then another, and then another. The bodies were stacked in layers, face down, 12 deep in places. They were wearing Polish military uniform. Most had their hands bound behind them with cord. Almost everyone had been shot once, at close range, at the base of the skull. The Germans, who by 1943 had a great deal of experience of mass graves, understood immediately what they had. They brought in an international commission of forensic experts, invited the international press, and made it the centerpiece of their propaganda for months. And the evidence was in the pockets. The bodies were well preserved. The men had been buried in uniform with their possessions on them, and the diggers recovered letters, diaries, identity documents, photographs, receipts, and newspapers. Every single one of those items stopped in the spring of 1940. The last diary entries were April 1940. The last letters were April 1940. The newspapers folded into tunic pockets were printed in April 1940. There was nothing later, not a scrap. That mattered because of a single fact of geography. In April 1940, that forest was not in German hands. It was 600 kilometers inside Soviet territory, and it would stay that way for another 14 months. Whoever killed these men, the Germans could not have done it. The Soviet Union said that they had. It said so in 1943, and in 1944, and at Nuremberg in 1946, and for the following 44 years. It was official history, taught in schools, defended by diplomats, and enforced inside Poland by a government that was not permitted to say otherwise. And for the whole of that time, the document that disproved it was in Moscow, in a sealed envelope, in the archive of the Politburo. It was never lost. It was never destroyed. Each new Soviet leader, on taking office, was shown what was inside, and then it was sealed again. This is an episode about a state that lied for half a century about a piece of paper it could have burned in 5 minutes, and chose not to. Every other episode in this series turns on a document that somebody tried to get rid of, or forgot about, or filed in the wrong building. This one turns on a document that was deliberately, carefully preserved by the people it incriminated for as long as their state existed. To understand how those men came to be in that forest, you have to start with a deal between two dictatorships. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact. Attached to it was a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between them. On the 1st of September, the Germans invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th, the Soviets invaded from the east. Poland collapsed in 5 weeks and ceased to exist as a state. The Soviet Union took roughly 250,000 Polish prisoners. Most of the ordinary conscripts were released or handed over. What the NKVD kept was a very specific category of person, officers, and with them police officers, border guards, prison staff, and men holding reserve commissions. That last group matters more than it sounds. Poland's Reserve Officer Corps was drawn from its educated class. Held in those camps were doctors, lawyers, university lecturers, engineers, teachers, journalists, government officials, and priests, a substantial part of the professional leadership of an entire country, collected in one place. If you wanted to remove a nation's capacity to rebuild itself after the war, this was the group you would take. There is no evidence the decision was framed that way in writing. There is also no version of it in which the effect was not obvious to the people making it. They were held at 3 camps, Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, in monasteries and religious houses converted for the purpose. Through the winter of 1939, the Nikavad interrogated them, assessed them, and tried to identify anyone who might be turned into a collaborator. The conclusion was that almost none of them could be. They were, in the phrasing of the reports, hardened and irredeemable enemies of Soviet power. So on the 5th of March 1940, the head of the NKVD, Lavrenti Beria, sent a memorandum to Stalin. It described the prisoners, it gave the numbers, and it proposed that they be dealt with by the supreme penalty, shooting, without the prisoners being summoned, without charges being laid, and without any of them appearing before a court. Approximately 14,700 men in the camps, and around 11,000 more held in prisons in the occupied territories of Western Ukraine and Belarus. Roughly 25,700 people proposed for execution in a single document. The Politburo approved it the same day. The memorandum carries the signatures on its face. Stalin's is first, across the top. Voroshilov, Molotov and Mikoyan signed beneath it. That is the document, 1 page of typescript and 4 signatures, and every one of the graves follows from it. Notice what the proposal does not contain. There is no charge, no evidence, no individual assessment, and no trial of any kind. The men are described as a category, counted, and disposed of as an administrative problem. It took 1 page. The killings began in early April 1940 and ran for about 6 weeks. The men from Kozelsk were taken by rail to Smolensk, and then by truck into the forest at Katyn. The men from Starobelsk were taken to the NKVD building in Kharkiv. The men from Ostashkov were taken to Kalinin, now Tver. The procedure was bureaucratic, and it was industrial. At Kalinin, the executions were carried out in a soundproofed cellar room, at night, 1 man at a time, over the course of weeks. The prisoner was brought in, his identity was confirmed against a list, and he was shot in the back of the head. The bodies were taken out by truck before dawn to a burial site at Mednoy. The officer who supervised that site was later decorated for it. The total is usually given as around 22,000. The precise figure is not fully settled, because the record-keeping was itself part of the concealment, but the range is narrow and it is not seriously disputed. These were not soldiers killed in battle, and they were not shot during a retreat by frightened men. Every one of these deaths was scheduled. Somebody drew up the transport lists, somebody arranged the trucks, somebody ordered the burial pits dug in advance. Then the family started writing letters, and the letters came back. Thousands of Polish families had been receiving mail from the camps through the winter. In the spring of 1940 it stopped, everywhere, at once. Wives and mothers wrote to the camps and to the Red Cross and to Soviet authorities and were told nothing at all. And when the war changed sides, the question could no longer be avoided. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Moscow suddenly needed a Polish ally. A Polish army was to be raised on Soviet soil from prisoners held across the Usar, under General Władysław Anders. Anders assembled his army and found that thousands of his officers were missing. He raised it directly with Soviet officials, repeatedly, at the highest level, and produced lists of names. He was told they had been released, that they had gone to Manchuria, that the records were confused, that the matter would be looked into. The Polish government asked, the British asked. The answers were the same and they were false, and the men who gave them knew what was in the envelope. Then, in 1943, the Germans found the graves. For the Polish government in exile in London, this was an impossible moment. The Nazis were their enemy, and were at that moment murdering Polish civilians on an industrial scale. Believing German propaganda was intolerable, but the officers were genuinely missing, and the evidence in those pockets was very specific. The Polish government asked the International Committee of the Red Cross to investigate. That request was the trigger. Stalin accused the Poles of collaborating with Hitler and broke off diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile within days. It was a rupture with long consequences. It removed the legitimate Polish government from the settlement of Poland's future and cleared the ground for a Soviet-installed one. It also worked, from Stalin's point of view, exactly as intended. Raising the question had been made into an act of collaboration with Nazi Germany. After April 1943, anyone who asked about Katyn could be answered with an accusation rather than an explanation. Britain and the United States did not press the point. Their own officials had access to the same evidence, and some of them reached the correct conclusion in internal reports. A British diplomatic report concluded the Soviets were responsible. It was suppressed. Roosevelt dismissed the German claims as a plot. Churchill's private position was that the less said about it, the better. It was 1943. The Red Army was the reason the war was going to be won. Two governments made a decision that the truth about 22,000 murdered allies was less important than the coalition, and they were not confused about what they were doing. In September 1943, the Red Army retook Smolensk, and the graves were back in Soviet hands. A commission was appointed under a distinguished surgeon, Nikolai Burdenko. It exhumed the site, examined the bodies, and reported in January 1944 that the men had been killed by German forces in the autumn of 1941. Witnesses testified. Documents were produced showing later dates. The commission's findings were false, and the process was managed. Materials had been placed in the graves. Witnesses had been prepared. The Soviet Union then took it to Nuremberg. The prosecution included Katyn in the indictment against the German leadership and presented the Burdenko findings as evidence. The German defense attacked it, called witnesses, and pointed at the dates. The tribunal heard the argument and then quietly dropped the charge. Katyn does not appear in the judgment. No finding was made. It is one of the few occasions on which the Nuremberg court declined to convict on a Soviet submission, and it said nothing about why. That silence is its own small cover-up inside the larger one, and it belongs in the account. The Soviet Union manufactured the lie. Its allies decided not to contradict it. For the next 4 decades, the lie held as official truth in the Soviet Union and in Poland. In Poland, it was enforced. The subject was censored. Families could not put the real date on a headstone. Poles who insisted on the truth privately, in a country where the truth was widely known privately, could lose their careers. In the West, it eroded slowly. A committee of the United States Congress investigated in 1951 and 1952 and concluded that the Soviet Union was responsible. That finding was accurate, and it changed nothing diplomatically. And in Moscow, the envelope sat in the archive. In March 1959, the head of the KGB, Alexander Shelepin, wrote to Khrushchev about it. His note set out the facts plainly. For internal purposes, 21,857 people executed under the 1940 decision, broken down camp by camp. And it made a recommendation. The individual case files of the executed, tens of thousands of folders, served no operational purpose and represented a risk. He proposed destroying them. The files were destroyed, but the core documents were not. The Beria Memorandum, the Politburo decision, and Shelepin's own note recommending the destruction were placed together in a sealed packet in the Politburo's closed archive. The proposal to destroy the evidence became part of the evidence and stayed there for another 33 years. That is the strangest fact in this story, and it is worth asking why. The most convincing answer is that within that system, the paper was not only proof of a crime, it was proof of authority. It established that the killings had been properly ordered by the Politburo, with signatures, through correct procedure. Destroy it, and the executions become the unauthorized act of individuals. In a bureaucracy built on written authorization, the document that convicts you is also the document that protects you. So the packet was kept, and each incoming General Secretary was shown it, and it was resealed. Consider the position of the men at the top of that state through those decades. Not one of them ordered the killings. Every one of them, on taking office, was handed the proof of who had, and continued the denial. The lie was inherited, and each of them chose to keep it. In 1990, under Gorbachev, the position finally moved. On the 13th of April, the anniversary of the German announcement, the Soviet Union publicly admitted that the NKVD had carried out the killings and expressed profound regret. Camp documents were handed to Poland. The core packet came later, and the manner of it is remarkable. Gorbachev, leaving office, told Yeltsin and his advisor Alexander Yakovlev there was one file they should see first, and read it aloud to them: Beria's memorandum with Stalin's signature on it, and Shelepin's note with the total. In 1992, the contents of package number 1 were declassified and transferred to Poland and handed to President Lech Wałęsa. 52 years after the 5th of March 1940, the Poles were given the piece of paper. It has not fully closed. Russia's own criminal investigation ran through the 1990s and was terminated in 2004, with much of its findings classified and a refusal to characterize the killings as genocide. The family's attempts to obtain formal legal rehabilitation of individual victims have largely failed in Russian courts. There was one further turn. In April 2010, a Polish delegation flew to Smolensk for the 70th anniversary. The aircraft crashed on approach in fog, killing everyone aboard, including the President of Poland. Later that month, the Russian archives published the Katyn documents online, and in November the Russian parliament passed a statement affirming that the massacre had been carried out on Stalin's direct order. Denial still circulates. It circulates against the position of the Russian state itself, which acknowledged responsibility in 1990 and again in 2010, and against a document that has been published in facsimile and is available to anyone. What finally moved was not the evidence. The evidence had been the same since 1940. What moved was the state's need for the lie. So here is where it lands. They destroyed the case files, tens of thousands of them, on a specific written recommendation, precisely to prevent this from ever being provable. And then they filed the recommendation. For 52 years, the Soviet Union maintained an official history that a single sheet of typescript in its own archive contradicted absolutely. The men who defended that history at Nuremberg knew. The men who enforced it in Warsaw knew. Every general secretary from Stalin to Gorbachev was personally shown the envelope and personally chose to reseal it. Everything anyone needed to know was written down, signed by 4 men, and kept, not in spite of the lie, but underneath it, in an envelope, for half a century.